Ivan, so good to see you back, and really grateful for your willingness to engage in another little Zoom conversation. The last learning module for our students in Worship Foundations is entitled Bath and Table. So we're looking at baptism and communion, and I just wondered if you would be willing to share a little bit of your understanding of the kind of Celtic understanding of those things, because I know from conversation with you, it is different.
It is different. Okay, one of the first major things to note is that the Celtic Church often referred to sacraments as mysterion, using more the Greek term than the Latin term. So mysterion is a sense of entering into the mystery of what God is about rather than trying to set aside what God is about. So if you keep that in mind, you're entering into more of the Celtic mind, the mystical, the spiritual, rather than trying to define things. The mysterion, the sacraments of the Celtic Church were two, baptism and communion. These were seen as being instituted by Christ and therefore were other ones, but were the main sacraments. However, there was also a sense of a sacramental nature or a mystery in other actions of the church. They never brought them down to 7 or whatever other continental Christians had. They said in every act of worship of entering to God, we entered into the mystery of God, which is something akin to orthodoxy, where you ascend into worship and you're in the mystery, the Hagia Sophia, the holy wisdom of the conversation between the persons of the Trinity. So the sacraments were all seen as being mystery, and wonderful mystery, revealing mystery, that when you came in faith, spoke to you. Keep that in mind. It's the first distinction. In looking at the two that they set aside as sacraments or mysterion, the major ones were baptism and communion. Baptism was conceived of differently. The Celtic word for baptism doesn't mean to wash or just to dip in. It means to be immersed, but not in the sense of immersion as a sense of submerged underwater. I always use the analogy of a pickle. You pick a little cucumber, you wash it, okay? You get it cleaned. Then you put it in the brine. And by putting it in the brine, immersing it in the brine, the cucumber flavors the brine, but it also takes on the flavor of the community. And baptism for them was that, putting somebody in the community, not just water being done, but immersing somebody in the community so they flavored the community and the community flavored them. Right. And they became an essential part of what it meant to be a pickle. If you get that in your mind, that was baptism to the Celtic Church.
So in that respect, Ivan, it would need to happen within community. It is
always in community.
You know, we often get the request about, I want to get my baby done, and people would like to do it privately, and it's as if the act of baptism is somehow separate from the community, but the Celtic understanding was very much immersed in community.
Very much so. It had to be immersed in community, take on the flavor of the community, and that meant everything in the community. Not just, being there on Sunday, but being involved in Bible study, being involved in play groups, being involved in everything about the community. You became an essential part of the community, and the community became an essential part of you. The other thing that would be unique in this is that for bringing the baby to be baptized, the baby was brought by other people to the church. And it's seen as you're bringing this baby to God and you're giving the baby to God. And God receives the baby and makes the baby a part of God's family kind of thing. And then God chooses to whom to give the baby, to bring up the baby, trusting that these people to whom God is giving the baby will be faithful members of the community.
Am I right? It had absolutely nothing to do with any sense of sin.
We're going to get to that in a moment.
Okay.
Okay, so the scary part of this was that the cleric could choose to not give the baby back to the parents. And the parents came with that intrepidation, that somebody could be better at raising this baby. And because they love the baby, God loved the baby more, and God would give the baby to somebody else. So it's very much a sense of clan, of being family. So you were given into the clan. And 99% of the time, the cleric gave the baby back to the real parents. But there was not the expectation that had to be done.
Okay.
Because there was the community that was raising the child, not necessarily the parents. Do you follow me?
Yeah.
So therefore, there's a sense of in the community, everybody was your auntie, your uncle, your relation. We have the prayer, God bless mummies and daddies and grandparents too, aunties and uncles and friends old and new. So that was a sense of community that you were immersed, you're baptized into.
Right.
So keep that in mind.
And we talk about that whole sensibility of it takes a village to raise a child.
And that was very much Celtic understanding. Okay. Now, moving back to what happened in baptism. In the Celtic church, among the Celtic peoples, there was 3 senses of baptism. And I want to say 3 acts of baptism, but that's not quite right. In Gaelic, there are Bashtik na Navrija, Bashtik na Clerich, Bashtik na Shiri. Bashtik na Navrija was called the baptism of bride, or Saint Bridget. And Saint Bridget was seen as being the handmaiden of Mary, who delivered Jesus in Celtic mythology. So whenever the midwife come to deliver a baby, she always had water. And she would take and dip her finger in the water and put a drop of water, 3 drops of water on the baby's head. And it was a drop for the source, from which everything comes, a drop for the incarnation, the manifestation, and a drop for life. So that was considered the baptism of the midwife. It wasn't a clerical baptism. As you see, you're not using certain words, but it's a drop for the source from which all comes, a drop for the incarnation, for the presentness, and a drop for the life. Baptish Navrija, baptism of bride, of Bridget. The second one was Baptish na Cleric. And as you hear the word cleric, you understand baptism of the church, of the clerical, which was done in the name of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, same as it does in the continent. But remember, the Celtic people didn't conceive those words in exactly the same way as the continental people did. The Father was the source of all, from which all things come, okay? And it had nothing to do with gender. So Susan, you're a teacher, okay? You're teaching your students, you're giving them life, you're giving them wisdom. You would be referred to in Celtic theology as Father.
Right.
Nothing to do with gender, but what you do. And the Son was not seen as being male offspring, was seen the outpouring of God into human existence.
Right.
So to baptize, you've been received in this outpouring of God, this community, okay? And the Spirit was seen as the one that animates, brings to life. So the Spirit is bringing you animation, bringing life. So the baptism of the cleric was into this mystery of all these wonderful things. But it was seen as very much Father, Son, and Holy Spirit as the continental people were baptizing, but different. Not baptizing into some merit, but you're baptizing into the community that was going to raise you. We're brought up community first. The last baptism was Baptist Shiri, and Shiri is forever. And it was done when somebody was dying. And any Christian, but usually the cleric, any Christian could go and take water, and you'd make the sign of the cross on the dying person's forehead. And you'd say, "Remember, O Spirit, whence you came and whither you were traveling. You were baptized into Christ we give you now." So it's almost like last rites, okay? And that was where they washed away sins, okay? At the very end of your life, remember that God is love, and all the sins that you're washed away. Now, you have to understand the concept of sin was not a moral infringement, but something that blinded you from God. So in the first baptisms, when all the baptisms were done, it was as you were washing away all those things which stop you from seeing God. Because they said when a child is born, the child sees directly into the face of God, and God sees into the face of the child. And then the world starts trying to form the child in its image rather than in the image of God. So it starts taking little babies and wraps them in tight clothes when they come into the world naked. And starts putting little boys in blue and little girls in pink, trying to form them into something maybe they're not.
Right.
Okay, and that was considered as being sin because you're breaking that perfect relationship. So at the very end, you're washing away all that blinds you. So this person is dying can see the face of God and go home.
Right.
Okay.
Reminiscent of Paul, and now I see in a mirror dimly, but then I shall see face to face.
Yeah, and they pulled those threads out of Paul's writings of what baptism is. So if you look at it that way, it's an interesting thing. In the last baptism, the baptism of eternity, Gushiri, there was sent the words "Curav hukum and piachin acham," or orm, which literally translate could have put away hukum from me, and piachin the sins that have settled on me. So the concept there was the person was not sinful,
right?
But sin had come and blinded them, and you want God to wash away those sins. So now I can see you face to face. Okay. So that was the distinction of what was happening. The Mediterranean concept or the continental concept was a person was sinful.
Right.
In the Celtic concept, the person was not sinful. The world broke relationship with God by putting these things on you. And the last thing you did for a person when they're dying was to wash away that so they could see the face of God again and go home.
How beautiful.
Okay. So it's a different concept.
Right.
So do you have any questions about that concept around baptism?
No, the students may, as I post our lecture for them to reflect on. And I really do think, Ivan, that at some point we need to do a more advanced worship course that will allow for, deeper engagement with this. But I think this is really helpful. Do you have any suggestions for students who want to look more deeply into this aspect of sacraments, who they should read?
There's a couple of good authors. The best one you're going to get is John O'Donoghue. And John, well, he's about our age, but he's dead. But he was a native Gaelic speaker from the west of Ireland, and he understood the mind and the mentality. And he could explain things in such a way that it became very clear. Probably one of his best books he put together is An Cherach, which means a soul friend, a friend of the soul. But any of his writings are very good at explaining Celtic theology and Celtic understanding of the world. Philip Newell is another great author. He writes many books from a spiritualist point of view. He understands greatly the Celtic mind, although he himself was not raised in that mind. You've got people who poo-poo it. And one of the greatest ones is Ian Bailey, okay, out of Aberdeen. Great writer, very scientific, very literal, but he tries to dismiss all the time the Celtic Church and Celtic theology. He comes from a completely English background, completely almost continental background that says no.
Okay.
But very good scholar.
Excellent. Thank you, Ivan. So let's move from bath and go to table. So let's talk for a few minutes about the Celtic understanding of communion.
I'm glad you used the word table and not altar. That's the first thing to note. The Celtic concept of communion was we are gathered around a table. And you think of the banquet feast of heaven, that was their image rather than a sacrifice.
Right.
So that set them a little bit apart from the continental Christians as well. In the sense of coming around a table, so important to Celtic theology, still important here in the Maritimes, is the kitchen.
Absolutely.
Kitchen party, you gather in the kitchen, you have a party, your friend, that was seen as being communion, okay? And the sense also, when you come to communion, it's not just those who we see, but those who we can't see. So there's a great communion of the saints. The great cloud of witnesses is mostly brought up in the Celtic liturgies around communion. So when we come there, it could only be one or two of us, but we're surrounded by millions, gazillions of people. Everyone who's died in faith, joins us. Because Christ holds them, and Christ holds us, and Christ brings us together in the kitchen, around the table. So that was the Celtic mind of communion. We're brought together around the table. Christ is there, real presence, okay? Not present in the bread and in the wine, but present at the table. Not off in eternity or heaven, but present at the table. And that's the first thing to set apart from the differences of communion.
That has always struck me, Ivan, when we are given the privilege of celebrating at the table, and those words of invitation that say, this is not the table of the United Church of Canada, this is not the table of any church, this is the table of Jesus Christ, and on behalf of Jesus Christ, I invite you to the table. Like, it gives me shivers because there is an embodiment there that I just think is so profound.
Yeah, I think you have to remember that it would be anathema, completely inconceivable to the Celtic Church, that communion would be denied to anybody.
Right.
Okay, that was another major thing. A communion wasn't owned by the church. Like, you didn't have to be in agreement with the church to receive communion. You had to be in agreement with Christ. And who knows your agreement with Christ? There was that concept. Mm-hmm. So when the Celtic Church or the Continental Church would talk about, no, you're not in communion. Okay, the Celtic Church was sort of shakes. How can the church control communion? There's this kind of inconceivable thing. It's a mystery. And we're entering into the mystery. And your idea of what happens in mystery and my idea are radically different maybe, but we're entering into mystery together. So in the Celtic Church, there's a sense of all of God's children should receive communion, regardless of your faith or lack of faith. Because in coming to communion, you open the door, you sit at table, you learn things, you hear things, you grow in faith by hearing the stories around the table. So everybody should come to the table to hear the stories.
Right.
So that was a major distinction there. Going to bread and wine. The Celtic Church had a sense of any time we gathered together around a table, we were having communion. Thus, grace was said before a meal, which is kind of a pre-communion prayer. Right. And grace was always said after communion, which is sort of a post-communion prayer. After a meal, which is post-communion prayer. So we have these carryovers still. And if you go to the Celtic homes, a lot of times grace is said before and thanks is offered afterwards. The sense of gathering around a table is always communion. They would use similar words, well, the same words as the continental Christians use, different meaning. This is my body that is broken for you. Okay? Very much believe that when they were breaking the body, not of bread or not the body of Jesus, but they're breaking open the corpus of Jesus' teaching. So they break through. This is my body, the body of my teachings that are broken for you. Now let's discuss them. And there's a sense of, after taking the bread and breaking the bread, that we're going to meet Jesus, we're going to talk about Jesus, we're going to understand Jesus, we're going to hear Jesus, we're going to enter into a different relationship with Jesus. Okay.
So that's very much like the Emmaus Road experience.
Yes. Yes.
Breaking of the bread.
And they recognized Jesus. Okay. So in the Celtic Church, they broke the bread and then they talked about Jesus and they recognized Jesus and they had communion with Jesus. Okay. Not with the bread, but just the conversation with Jesus. And that was for them communion. At the end of this discussion, which involved people talking about, like, it wasn't just the cleric standing there and doing things. It involved the community talking about Jesus, telling about their experience, like almost a prayer meeting or a witnessing meeting or something like this. The body was broken open. They talked about the verses that spoke to them and so on and so forth. And they each ate the bread because they were entering this is the portion that I remember. And then they tell, this is the portion that I remember.
So it sounds like a much more integrated experience rather than a separated ritual or liturgy, that it was a far more integrated experience into the life and faith of those who gathered.
Well, if you read Paul's letter to Corinth, that's basically what happened. They gathered for a meal. Okay. Right. And they broke open the bread and then they had the wine at the end kind of thing. And they had this meal in the midst. This is what the Celtic Church saw communion as being.
Right. Well, and I mean, when we think about Jesus and the Last Supper, the bread is broken at the beginning, the wine is poured at the end.
Yes. Yes. Two separate acts. Okay. And that's not to say that the meal was forever in the Celtic Church. There was times when they come together and the bread was broken and the cup was blessed and okay. At the end of this meal, at the end of this table ceremony, they would take a jug of wine. And this is where you get the expression, the parting glass. Okay. They'd all take this common wine and they'd all drink a health. Mm-hmm. As you take, cheers to the health, to the host of this meal. Okay. And they'd all drink. Since we're all coming together, we're all taking this common drink kind of thing. This host of the meal is gathered together, we're receiving the drink that comes from Christ's hands. Here, the parting glass. Okay? No sense of being the blood of Christ. But they'd use those words in the sense that the blood was the life force. So he's given us the life force, this thing that makes life happy, this wine. At the wedding feast of Cana in Galilee, he took the common elements and made them mystical and wonderful. So Christ has taken this and he's given us this drink of wine together, filling us with joy. Okay? So there was that really different sense of what the wine was about. They say the blood of Christ is the life force of Christ. This is the cup of salvation. Okay?
As opposed to a sacrificial blood offering.
Sacrifice was completely unknown in the Celtic Church. Okay? And we pick up that with Pelagius and Augustine are arguing over, what is the God? Did God send his son into the world to die? What kind of a God are we worshiping then that would send his own son in the world with the sense of he had to murder his own son to please his own self of sacrifice? That was completely unconceivable.
So Ivan, I didn't know I was Celtic for a long time.
It's in us. I hate to tell you, it's in us.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
So they would use the same words. This is the body of Christ. This is the blood of Christ, but not conceive them anyways. They were more into the mystery, the mysterion of what was here, rather than the literalism. Because remember, the Celtic Church was anything but literalist.
Right. Okay. Right. Well, thank you for sharing that. I know that we could go on and talk for a whole lot longer.
So many more things to say.
So many more things to say, but I think that this will give students, sort of that alternative perspective, which I think is really, really helpful. And it's always a joy just to spend some time with you and see how you just become so absolutely animated when given the opportunity to talk about something that just means so much to you. So just thank you so much.
It's my pleasure.
All right.